So my talk is going to be basically about two things. The major part is going to be talking about an ethical framework that can be basically embedded into governance and into AI and some of the challenges. And in the last part, depending on how much time I have, I'll talk a little bit more about the publication that's coming out in about a week, where and that's more about promoting the ideas. So the nice thing about being at a conference like this is that you don't have to persuade people about the importance of suffering. I think that we all have this kind of shared ethic and conviction that suffering really matters, and that applies obviously to both human suffering and to animal suffering, both human-caused suffering and also suffering in the wild. So I founded OPIS about 9 years ago, and really the goal was, as the name says, is to really promote the idea that suffering matters, and to try to promote specific causes, not causes themselves, but solutions to the various causes of suffering. A lot of our work to date has been about access to pain relief in humans, and so we've been doing advocacy on that. Including access to morphine for people, especially in developing countries that don't have access, and also more recently access to psychedelics for people with excruciating cluster headaches, one of the worst conditions known to medicine. And we've also been advocating, though not so specifically, for anti-speciesism and an end to factory farming, and we've done a little work on peace building related to the terrible conflict in Israel and Palestine. But the goal since the beginning has been to take a more of a meta approach and promote the underlying ethics. So these are questions that have really driven me since the beginning. And the key question is, the starting point really for everything is what matters. And from there we can then think, what do we do about it? And then more specifically, and these are things I'm going to be talking about, are how do we formalize it, and specifically, how do we then promote it and embed it into our governance systems? So these are the kinds of questions I've addressed in my two books. The first one was a little bit more about what matters, and in the Tango of Ethics, I go a little bit more deeply into trying to formulate some sort of coherent ethical framework. What I've tried to do is to challenge some of the biases and assumptions that go into a lot of ethical thinking, really going back hundreds of years. And yeah, to challenge some of the biases that might prevent us from looking at reality, I would say, a little bit more authentically. And one of the key biases that I try to challenge is something called existence bias. You might recognize here that these are cryogenic vats where some rich, sick people try to prolong their existence forever. The term existence bias was coined by German philosopher Thomas Metzinger, and he basically described it as our deepest cognitive bias, which basically says that people will do almost whatever they can to prolong their own existence. And you can see how this would be deeply hardwired through the process of evolution. We can see it in our own everyday actions and thinking and behavior. The problem is it also has a lot of influence on the way that moral philosophers think about ethics and the kind of ethical frameworks that they promote. But there's an obvious dichotomy between two potentially conflicting priorities, and how do we decide between them? How much does suffering matter compared to the preservation of life and consciousness? And this is sort of a running theme of my work and the stuff I've been writing on, and also this presentation. And we see the existence bias in the way we think about value in society. We have this paradigm that value needs to be increased. And we see this economically, of course, with this focus on increasing GDP, increasing shareholder value. But we see it also in ethical thinking, and well, especially in utilitarian thinking, where there's this idea that we need to increase value, and usually that's expressed in terms of happiness or positive valence, and even to the point of using all of the available matter of the universe to maximize the amount of positive valence. And what seems to be left out in this kind of thinking is suffering. How does suffering fit into that? Suffering is almost seen as more of an inconvenience, something that decreases the overall value. Now, some of you may be aware of this short story. The name of the story is "The Ones Who Walk Away from OPIS." It was written by an American author, Ursula Le Guin. But I'll just go through it very quickly because it's a really good metaphor for thinking about ethics. Basically, you have a city where everybody's in a state of absolute happiness and bliss. The problem is all of this bliss, for unknown reasons, depends on the misery of one single child who's locked in the basement. And people become aware of that, or they are aware of it, and little by little there's a trickle of people leaving OPIS because they don't want their bliss to be dependent on the misery of one single child. And we see here that there are these conflicting intuitions. On the one hand, everybody wants to enjoy bliss. At the same time, people don't want their bliss to be causally linked, let's say, to one individual, even if it's just one individual. That goes against some very strong intuitions. But there's something else there's another conclusion we can draw from this. So if you look at the people who stay in the city, who don't leave, why are they doing this? Because that suffering there, okay, maybe it's just really unpleasant, but it could be a metaphor for really intolerable suffering. And people consider that suffering to be tolerable only because it happens in a different place, a different locus in space and time. And I think that's a pretty useful way of thinking about suffering in general, is that we tolerate the intolerable because it doesn't happen here, it happens somewhere else. And if you follow this reasoning, it means that really the only tolerable amount of extreme, unbearable suffering is zero. If you think about ethics as being how do we affect change in the world, then you can see there's a real difference between these three different states. And this is what's unique about suffering, is that only suffering has a call to action to change something about it. Bliss is a state that we value. Everybody's happy when they're experiencing bliss. But bliss itself doesn't require any call to action. There's no call to action. There's no need to change anything about it. But the same applies to nothingness. And here as an example, I used the planet Mars, an example of a lifeless planet. There's no absolute driving need to populate the planet with sentient beings. And this is really what makes suffering unique. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what I see as some of the flaws in some common reasoning, especially in utilitarian ethics. And utilitarianism, of course, is very much about impact, but some of the ways that utilitarianism is used, I think, are actually irrational. And one of the main aspects of utilitarianism is this idea of basically lumping together very different experiences and trying to derive single numbers out of it. So the first, what I consider to be a flaw, is the idea that we can add up these totally different experiences, happiness and suffering, and derive a number out of it. And here I've taken, if you look at the whole world, with all the happiness and suffering that exists on it, if the numbers, depending on the numbers that you get, you might get something positive and say, this is okay. But if you take a more suffering-focused perspective, you would say that none of the extreme suffering is okay, and that none of the happiness justifies that suffering. Suffering and happiness are two very different experiences, and they are not simply the opposite of one another. And this is an animation, or a shot from an animation from a short film I made a few years ago to try to illustrate that idea. Another flaw, which is perhaps less severe, but it also has implications for how we think about ethics, is the idea that that a certain amount of extreme suffering you can always find the equivalent in lots of instances of much more minor suffering. And this is a metaphor I use in my book, The Tango of Ethics. And what I said is that you can go up or run up lots of little hills, and you'll never get the altitude sickness you can get by running or by walking up a single Himalayan mountain peak. So the amount of vertical meters you go up may be the same, but the actual consequences are different. Now, that doesn't mean that we might still need to make trade-offs that we find reasonable. And I think the real point I'm making is that there isn't always a clear rational answer about what to do in these kinds of situations, especially when the intensity of the suffering is more similar. Now, we can apply this to a very specific situation that some of the people at this conference are working on, and that's insect suffering. It's been estimated there are around 10 to the 19 insects, and a key question is, do they suffer intensely? So if you follow the reasoning that I've been suggesting, you might say that if insects can suffer a little bit, but they can never suffer, like a pig on a factory farm, then it doesn't matter how many there are, it still is not a moral catastrophe. In the same way that 8 billion humans who sometimes suffer a paperclip or a stubbed toe, it's not the end of the world. If insects can suffer intensely, that's a whole different story. That would mean that insect suffering is far and away the worst source of suffering on our planet. But then what happens if we estimate that it's not that likely that they suffer intensely, but that maybe there's a 1% chance? I would say then if you applied expected value reasoning, multiplying the number by the probability, you would still arrive at the conclusion that the expected value of insect suffering is still much larger than that of any other sentient beings. I'm not sure this is the best way to think about it. I'm not sure if expected value really, if it's rational to apply it in this way to this one key question about the determinants of suffering. But I think here as well, we run up against the limits of what rationality can tell us. And so this is actually, again, this is actually one of the key ideas that I'm trying to communicate, is that there are limits to what rationality can tell us. And that has implications for defining a very precise ethical framework that we can use in particular for AI. But I think one conclusion is that regardless, it's really imperative that we maintain our main focus on extreme suffering. So, we're talking about, we have this existence bias. We all have this very strong intuition that we want to thrive and survive and enjoy life, and at the same time, we're aware of the severity of this tremendous call to action of severe suffering. And how do we deal with it? And so this is from the cover of my last book. And basically what I suggest is that we find ourselves in a dance between these two different ways of being in the world. So on the one hand, we are human beings who want to thrive and respect our intuitions, including our moral intuitions, like not concentrating suffering, not causing harm. And at the same time, we also are moral agents that want to reduce as much as possible the amount of extreme suffering in the world. You can see a certain similarity, if you're familiar with Buddhism, with the concept of the middle way, which is basically the idea of walking a sort of a path in between the extremes of hedonism and asceticism. But I would say that in the dance, we're not trying to stay right in the middle. We're trying to adopt both perspectives, that we want to enjoy life, but we also want to spend as much of our time as possible and our resources trying to prevent extreme suffering. So I'd like to talk a little bit now about the risks of AI and how what I've been talking about relates to it. So a lot of the focus on AI risks is about X risks, the risk of AI actually wiping us out. But if we're able to avoid that, there's still the question of what the AI will value. And I think it's really extremely important that we get the right values into AI. And I'd just like to read for you a little an excerpt from the Tango of Ethics that deals with this question. So even if we were able to accurately capture a snapshot of society's current values and then stably program them into an AI, or have the AI learn our values and goals through observation, this would be a devastatingly lost opportunity for ethical progress. In our world today, we still torture non-human animals on a massive scale. We deprive people in horrendous pain of legal access to effective medication. We allow people to go hungry and homeless and to die of preventable diseases. We imprison and torture people in many countries for not having the right beliefs or saying the right things. And we allow the wealthiest to control governance mechanisms to enrich themselves and accumulate resources. If this is the data set from which AI will learn society's values, that could portend a very bleak future. Surely, we would want to encode a powerful AGI with the most utopian ethical framework we can, rather than lock in the prevailing ethics of the early 21st century. So in a sense, if we're defining the long-term future that will be dominated by AI, we want to do a lot better, and we want it to be a lot more compassionate and rational than, let's say, the evolutionary forces that led to our existence. But there's a problem, because we've got two very different kinds of values that we might want to program into AI. If we give the weight to the value of not killing us off, there's a risk of huge amounts of extreme suffering occurring in the future. At least there's a potential for that. On the other hand, if we say that the core value is don't allow any extreme suffering, the AI might actually conclude that the best thing to do is just to kill us all off. And Thomas Metzinger came up with the term benevolent artificial antinatalism, or BAN, which is a risk for what an AI could do if it really, if it cares about suffering, or even if it concludes itself that extreme suffering is an absolute evil, something that we need to avoid. I don't know how many people here are familiar with negative utilitarianism. It's an ethical philosophy that it hasn't really caught on within the academic moral philosophy field, and neither very much, for the most part, within the rationalist and EA movement. But I don't think this means that the actual ethical framework is not legitimate. But there are some concerns associated with it, and one of them is that it doesn't seem to respect the things that humans actually value, all the positive goods that we like. And the other concern is that, of course, taken to an extreme, it could suggest that we have some sort of a duty to wipe ourselves out, to voluntarily go extinct. In order to address these concerns and assuage them, I've proposed a variation, which is actually quite different in a way, which I call X and U+. And so utilitarianism maintains this focus on impact, but without what I consider to be the flaws of aggregation. Negative, of course, focuses on suffering. The X puts all the emphasis on extreme suffering so that we don't get distracted by things like pinpricks and stub toes and so on. And then the plus is doing a lot of work here. The plus, it captures the deep human intuition to survive and to thrive. So it's a way of capturing both the urgency of dealing with suffering and our human intuitions without trying to put them on the same level and balance them out against each other. These are really two different modes of existence, the activist mode and then the more intuitive human mode. But then the question is it actually possible, even if we agreed that this is a reasonable framework, is it actually possible to embed it into AI? You may recognize this. This is a screenshot from a video put out a few years ago by Boston Dynamics, and they were showing how incredible the robots are because they can dance. But I'm using it, of course, as a metaphor. Is it possible for an AI to actually do this dance that we might do ourselves between these two different modes of being? Maybe that's not the relevant way of thinking about it, but another way of looking at it is, could we model an AI on the characteristics of a benevolent dictator that values both the prevention of extreme suffering, but also maintaining our existence? And if we can't do that, then what? Well, it seems that the obvious alternative solution is that we do whatever we can to fight to maintain control. This is an illustration that we had made for the publication I'll tell you about in a few minutes. That tries to capture the challenge that we face. And I think what's interesting here is that it's sort of another way of framing the alignment problem, is that we actually do want human beings with the capacity to feel empathy and compassion and love, to be driving the algorithms, to be maintaining control. Because once there's no longer a sentient being that can feel all these human emotions, we're left at the mercy of zeros and ones for eternity. And that's probably not a situation that feels very safe or comfortable. I was actually a little bit surprised how many people here are very much concerned about digital minds, and I'm just have one slide to where I just want to bring up, of course, the possibility that AI, perhaps not in its current form, but in some other form, could be sentient and could suffer. So personally, I'm skeptical that AI in its current form is actually capable of suffering. But I again want to read you a little a short excerpt again from the Tango of Ethics. If I can find it here. So what I wrote was, although the prospect of suffering machines sounds like science fiction, its realization would be terrifying. It could potentially happen by accident, as an unintended consequence of AI development, due to a lack of awareness that the AI is sentient, or plain indifference. It could even be a discounted side effect of intentionally creating sentience for research or industrial purposes. Worse, suffering machines could be deliberately created for aggressive purposes by man or machine, as a weapon of war, or simply out of sadism. And yeah, I seem to keep quoting Thomas Metzinger because he's got a lot of ideas that I think are really spot on. And he proposed a global moratorium on what he calls synthetic phenomenology. 2 minutes. Okay, I'm going to speed up the last bit of my talk. Basically, I think there's a need for some very ambitious and creative thinking about how we deal with these issues. And the key point is that we need global cooperation. I mean, a lot of people don't like to think about politics. You hear sometimes in the rationalist community that politics is the mind killer. But everything that we want to achieve is basically about trying to change the way the world works, and you can't do that without politics. So, and this is why for the past, actually for pretty much for the past 2 years, we've been working on this publication that is just going to come out in a week. And it's called Compassionate Governance, a Strategic Guide to Preventing and Alleviating Global Suffering. And we cover a lot of different issues, starting from the ethics, going all the way to various policy recommendations, and also talking about some of the insights from things like insights into from complexity science, the study of complex systems, conflict resolution, movement building. It's really basically drawing on wisdom from a bunch of different fields to provide something of a toolkit for policymakers, politicians, and others who are concerned about these issues. And I don't have time to go into much detail, but it's going to come out in about a week. If you want to scan the QR code, you can go to the page from where you'll be able to download it. And also on that page, you can sign up to our mailing list to be reminded when it comes out. I'll just run through very quickly some of the topics that we cover. There's this idea of, in terms of trying to influence people using both really heartfelt empathy and strategy, like negative and positive incentivization as tools. There are ideas such as trust and depolarization, the idea that just feeding people more information isn't always the answer, especially not just with politicians, but especially with the population at large. People don't change their ideas just because you give them more information. They want to be able to trust you. There are ideas about democratic reforms that can be more evidence-based and more inclusive and less beholden to the interests of career politicians. And there's a chicken there that I just added there, and this represents how do you bring the voices of non-human sentient beings into consideration. You can't necessarily bring chickens and pigs into deliberations, but you can ensure that their interests are built into the process. And finally, there's this idea of really having a movement for change, where we draw on some of the best ideas about how to spread an effective movement with ideas such as inclusivity, depolarization, and so on. And so we include some of these ideas that we think are especially important in the guide. So actually, I did get to the end here, and I've got a couple of websites, my own, the OPIS website, and then my email. If you have any questions, or just want to get in touch, I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone has. I don't know if we have time for questions now, but okay, great. Thanks very much.
The question is from Tristan. So Tristan is saying, it's not clear to me that suffering-focused ethicists such as Jonathan and utilitarians have a fundamental disagreement. As he acknowledged, suffering and happiness can both be traded off against each other, allowing us to choose to suffer in order to gain certain kinds of happiness. Isn't the issue more that such trade-offs are challenging rather than impossible? And in that sense, can suffering-focused ethics and utilitarians agree?
So I think we need to make a distinction between suffering that is voluntary and suffering that is involuntary. Or another way of looking at it in particular is intrapersonal trade-offs and interpersonal. So there's not a problem if somebody voluntarily experiences some kind of suffering so that they'll be able to experience some bliss in the future. It's not experienced as suffering in the same way. It's a very different situation when we try to have some sentient beings suffer so that others can experience bliss. And then we get into the problem that I've been talking about, is that there isn't any inherent need to create the bliss, something that we only enjoy when we experience it. Creating that suffering creates an immediate call to action.
An ethical framework that takes into account both utility and human survival, so it values both just inherently, sorry. Can you hear me? Yes. It inherently values human life and also utility. Is that because that aligns with your personal morals, or is it because you think that's just the only thing that we can get policy and the world to get on board with? Like, they wouldn't be on board with pure utilitarianism.
I mean, basically, everybody wants to survive. It's part of human nature. So to try to impose some kind of strange ethical framework that only focuses on reducing suffering, even if it makes sense intellectually, it's not tenable. I mean, it wouldn't work in practice. I don't think that very many people, even including myself, would feel comfortable, even on a personal level, trying to promote it. So, we're looking for what is actually feasible in the real world. We might come to the conclusion that, looking at all the suffering that's going on in the world, or even a fraction of it, we would never want to create a world in the form that it has right now. If we're to be really honest, that doesn't mean we want to self-destruct. It's part of the human condition is to reconcile ourselves with that paradox. And I think it's an honest ethical framework in the sense that it recognizes that this is who we are as humans, but we can still try to eliminate the worst aspects of existence and make it actually bearable.
So I guess I'm still a little bit confused about what your ethical view entails. So there's a couple of plausible intuitions. So you might think, for example, that suffering has increasing marginal moral significance. So very increasing marginal moral significance, such that very extreme suffering matters far more than small amounts of suffering. There's also an intuition there that there's something wrong in quantitatively representing pleasure and pain together across lives. And there also seems to be some kind of anti-aggregation intuition as well, namely that you can't compensate across lives. But I guess putting all of those things together, it's not clear to me if you were to say, look, an act is right if and only if X, what X is, what actually is your view beyond these kind of three different intuitions. So a moral theory should be formulatable, ideally, as an act is right if and only if X. What is the view?
In a way, you've really touched on the essence of a certain paradox. And if we try to specify very clearly, we can do that, but it's arbitrary, and we may not have another choice. I mean, we make these arbitrary choices in our daily lives as well. And my point is really that we can't depend on pure rationality, and at some point we just need to, if the choice is some unbearable extreme, then we might just have to say, okay, this is where we're putting the line. But I think we need to be honest about it.
Can you give me more of a justification for the need to create this new X and E plus framework, and in particular, how does it avoid the standard criticisms of normal utilitarianism?
Like I was saying, two of the main criticisms are that it doesn't value the things that we seem to care about. And another one, which I didn't maybe explicitly mention, is it seems to value avoiding pinpricks over creating huge amounts of bliss. And then the other one is that, taken to an extreme, it could lead to, in theory, a duty to destroy the world. By putting in the X, we get rid of this, criticism that we care about, minor suffering. It's really ensuring that we put the focus on extreme suffering. But the plus is basically saying, okay, we do value existence, and we need to find some sort of, there is this, I call it a sort of a dance, but it's like an oscillation between two different perspectives, and we try to maintain boundaries that we don't want to actually cross over. So I would say, it actually directly addresses these very criticisms, but it does so in a way that is consistent with our human intuitions, but without trying to put pluses and minuses together and saying that, if there are enough pluses, then we actually have a positive state that we want to replicate.
We've run out of time, but thank you very much for all the questions.